Chapter 6. The Lower Levels. While Mango and Popit investigated the upper floors, Alice and Mal were descending into a world entirely devoid of starlight. The iron staircase spiraled downward, its cold metal steps ringing faintly with every cautious footfall. At first, the ambient golden light from the library's massive atrium filtered down, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But as they descended deeper and deeper into the archives of dissonance, the light began to fade, swallowed by an unnatural, oppressive darkness. The air grew significantly colder, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and the damp earthiness of a deep cave. Alice paused on a narrow iron landing, clutching the freezing handrail. The darkness below them was absolute, thick as velvet. Panic began to prickle at her throat. She couldn't see a single inch in front of her face. Sensing her hesitation, Mal stopped a few steps ahead. He reached blindly into his leather pouch and pulled out the silver and gold disc. Instead of holding it up to his eye, he simply cupped the metal in his palm, focusing his thoughts on the flawless blue crystal at its center. Slowly, a faint pulsing azure light began to bleed from the stone. It wasn't nearly as bright as the glow it produced near a portal, but it was enough to cut through the immediate gloom, casting long, eerie shadows against the curving walls. Mal glanced back at her, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh blue light. He pointed down at the stairs, which were growing dangerously narrow, and then tapped his own shoulder, giving her a serious, silent look that clearly meant, "Stay close." Alice didn't hesitate. She reached out, her fingers gripping the rough fabric of Mal's linen tunic at his shoulder. With her other hand securely fastened to the freezing iron handrail, she followed close behind him. Together, they continued their slow, agonizing descent. For what felt like an age, there was nothing but the steady rhythm of their boots on iron and the faint pulsing blue glow of the device. The darkness pressed in on them, heavy and suffocating. Alice felt a sudden sharp pang of longing for the warm, chaotic energy of the briarwood, or even the blistering sun of Bast. Finally, the iron staircase ended. Alice's boots hit solid stone. Mal raised the blue crystal higher, illuminating the entrance to a massive cavern. But as they stepped off the bottom step, the darkness began to shift. Faint patches of pale, sickly green light began to bloom across the stone floor and the towering, jagged walls. It was bioluminescence, glowing moss and strange crystalline fungi that clung to the damp rock, casting the entire cavern in a deeply unsettling emerald gloom. Mal let out a long, silent breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as his eyes adjusted to the green twilight. It was undeniably clear that this place was entirely different from the upper stacks. It wasn't just the light, it was the entire ecosystem. The lower levels were alive, but not in the whimsical starlit way of the main library. As Alice and Mal stepped cautiously onto the stone path, the shadows around them seemed to writhe. Something that looked disturbingly like a nightmarish creature from the deep ocean, complete with a glowing, fleshy lure dangling from its head, floated lazily through the damp air, its milky white eyes unblinking as it passed mere inches above Alice's head. She shuddered, instinctively ducking and shrinking back. Mal immediately threw his arm out in front of her, shaking his head sharply in a silent warning not to touch anything. The warning was necessary. The ground was littered with jagged obsidian pedestals, each holding a heavy black-bound tome that seemed to absorb the sickly green light. And guarding these dark books were things that belonged in nightmares. A cluster of long, spindly legs entirely too thick to belong to a spider scuttled rapidly across the stone path just ahead of them, vanishing with a dry clicking sound into a crevice in the wall. Alice swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. No longer trying to be brave, she reached out and grabbed Mal's free hand, her fingers gripping his tightly. He didn't speak, but he gave her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze, not letting go as they continued forward. Alice looked around at the hundreds of jagged pedestals, a heavy sense of hopelessness sinking into her chest. The librarian had said Severin's coordinates would be down here, but how were they supposed to find one dark magician's realm among all of this? But Mal was moving with purpose. He was sweeping the blue light of his device over the nearest pedestals, his eyes scanning the cavern. He was looking for the archives of dissonance, searching for the specific, massive scar that tearing a rift in the multiverse would leave behind. He led Alice gently down a narrow, winding path between the jagged rocks, their boots crunching softly on patches of dried, glowing moss. The air down here was thick with malevolent energy, a stark contrast to the pure harmonic resonance of the briarwood portals. Suddenly, Mal froze. The blue crystal in his hand flared slightly, reacting to something in the dark. He pointed toward a massive arching doorway carved directly into the living rock at the far end of the cavern. The stone around the arch was pitch black, polished to a mirror-like shine, and completely devoid of the glowing fungi that coated the rest of the lower levels. Sitting on a pedestal in the centre of the archway was a single massive book bound in solid obsidian. Mal looked back at Alice, a thrill of terrifying discovery evident in his wide eyes. He didn't need to say a word. Alice knew instantly that had to be it. They crept toward the polished black archway, every step measured and agonizingly slow. The air here didn't just feel cold, it felt completely dead, stripped of even the faintest resonance of life. As Mal reached out to place his hand on the obsidian book, his arm abruptly stopped mid-air. Alice gasped silently, her eyes going wide. It wasn't that the book was too heavy. Mal hadn't even touched it. There was a solid, invisible wall of force surrounding the pedestal, radiating a deeply unnatural cold. It was a barrier specifically designed to repel anything that drew near. Mal pulled his hand back, his brow furrowing. He looked at the silver and gold disc in his other hand. He held the device up, gesturing with his head to Alice to stay back. He didn't speak. Instead, he gripped the disc tightly, focusing his will onto the flawless blue crystal. The azure light within it began to flare, pulsing in a rapid, almost frantic rhythm. Mal pressed the glowing device forward, directly against the invisible barrier. Sparks of dark, violet energy immediately hissed and popped in the silent cavern where the blue light met the force field. Mal grimaced, his jaw tight as he physically shoved against the invisible wall. Slowly, agonizingly, the blue light of the crystal began to cut a hole through the dark magic, melting the barrier just enough for him to slip his arm inside. He grabbed the heavy cover of the obsidian tome and hauled it open. Instantly, the entire cavern seemed to drop 10 degrees. A wash of absolute suffocating darkness poured out of the pages, completely swallowing the blue light of Mal's device. Alice stumbled back, terrified. She couldn't see the pages from where she stood, but she could see Mal. He was staring down into the book, perfectly still. Too still. His eyes were wide, completely unblinking, reflecting a sickly, swirling purple light that seemed to be rising from the tome. The veins in his neck were standing out, and his face was contorted in a silent scream. The dark energy of the book was pulling him in, taking him over, drowning his mind in pure dissonance. Alice's heart slammed against her ribs. She couldn't scream. She couldn't call for the cats. Do something, her mind roared. Out of sheer desperate instinct, she lunged forward. She grabbed Mal's arm, her fingers slipping down to close over his hand, which still loosely gripped the silver and gold disc. She tore the device from his fingers. Aiming the blue crystal directly at Mal's face, she desperately willed the stone to shine. A brilliant, blinding flash of pure starlight erupted from the device, hitting Mal square in the eyes. He jerked backward, gasping violently as the connection broke. Alice didn't stop. She spun around and shoved the blazing blue crystal directly against the open pages of the obsidian book. The dark, swirling magic shrieked, a soundless psychic wail that vibrated in her teeth before the heavy cover slammed shut with a heavy final thud. The invisible barrier snapped back into place instantly, throwing Alice backward onto the cold stone floor. She landed hard, her chest heaving as she scrambled backward, clutching the silver disc to her chest. Mal was on his hands and knees beside her, coughing violently and clutching his head as if it were about to split open. Alice crawled over to him, grabbing his shoulder, her eyes wide with frantic, silent questions. "Are you okay? What happened?" Mal looked up at her, his weathered face pale and slick with cold sweat. His eyes were wide with a terror she hadn't seen in him before. He forgot where they were. He forgot the librarian's warning. He forgot the absolute rule of the lower levels. "I know where he is," Mal gasped out loud, his voice raw and trembling in the dark. "I saw him." The words shattered the silence like dropping a boulder into a still pond. The sound echoed off the polished black archway, rippling outward into the sickly green gloom of the cavern. And then the lower levels woke up. All around them, the shadows began to writhe with sudden chaotic purpose. The clicking of thick spindly legs multiplied by the hundreds, echoing from the crevices in the walls. The nightmarish deep-sea creatures floating near the ceiling abruptly stopped their lazy drifting, their milky white eyes all turning simultaneously toward the source of the sound. A low collective hiss began to rise from the dark. No words had been spoken down here for uncounted centuries, and now every terrible forgotten thing in the archives of dissonance was coming to find the intruders who had broken the silence. Mal's eyes snapped wide as the collective hiss of the cavern rose into a deafening, clicking roar. The absolute stillness of the lower levels was gone, replaced by a violent, hungry frenzy. He didn't hesitate. "Run!" he gasped, his voice raw with terror. He snatched the silver and gold device from Alice's trembling fingers and hauled her to her feet by the back of her linen dress. They ran. Alice didn't look back at the obsidian pedestal, nor did she care about keeping quiet anymore. Her boots hammered frantically against the stone path, her breath coming in jagged, burning gasps. The sickly green bioluminescence of the cavern illuminated a nightmare. The jagged rock walls, which had seemed so still on their descent, were now boiling with motion. Thousands of thick, spindly legs the size of human arms scuttled out of every crevice, pouring down the stone like a dark, clicking waterfall. And above them, the air was suddenly thick with the nightmarish deep-sea creatures. They no longer floated lazily. Their milky white, unblinking eyes were fixed entirely on the running humans, their fleshy, glowing lures whipping through the air as they swam furiously after their prey. "Faster!" Mal yelled, shoving Alice ahead of him as they reached the base of the iron staircase. Alice hit the first step so hard, the sound echoed like a bell, ringing sharply up the dark metal shaft. But she didn't stop. She scrambled upward, her hands gripping the freezing iron handrail so tightly her knuckles turned white. Behind her, Mal brought up the rear, pointing the flawless blue crystal of his device downward like a desperate beacon. The azure light swept over the swarm, pursuing them. The scuttling spider things weren't just climbing the stairs, they were scaling the curved stone walls of the shaft itself, their countless legs clicking a terrifying rhythm against the rock as they kept pace with the humans' frantic climb. The ascent, which had felt agonizingly slow on the way down, was a blur of pure, exhausting terror. Alice's lungs burned, her legs feeling as heavy as lead with every step she hauled herself up. The air grew thicker, heavier, the smell of damp earth replaced by the foul, rotting stench of the creatures swimming blindly up the shaft behind them. "Don't stop, Alice!" Mal shouted, his voice cracking as the sound of snapping jaws echoed just below his boots. She didn't. She couldn't. She forced her burning muscles to keep moving, her eyes fixed entirely on the faint golden light filtering down from the top of the spiralling stairs. It seemed impossibly far away. The scuttling sound was deafening now. A long, pale, segmented arm shot out from the darkness, its hooked claws scraping against the iron step mere inches from Mal's heel. A second later, a massive, fleshy tentacle whipped through the air, slapping wetly against the handrail right next to Alice's hip. She let out a short, terrified scream, yanking her arm away and scrambling up the final flight of stairs on her hands and knees. The golden light of the library's massive atrium finally burst over them. Alice threw herself onto the polished wooden floor, collapsing onto her back, her chest heaving as she sucked in the clean, dry scent of ancient parchment and beeswax candles. A second later, Mal dove out of the stairwell, landing hard beside her. His chest was heaving, his face pale and dripping with sweat, the blue device still clutched tightly in his fist. But they weren't safe. The iron staircase was a boiling mass of dark movement. A dozen spindly, clicking legs breached the top step, hauling a massive, segmented body into the golden light of the atrium. Behind it, thick, wet tentacles slapped onto the polished wood, dragging up the nightmarish, milky-eyed horrors of the deep. Alice scrambled backward, completely exhausted, her back hitting the base of the moonstone desk. She couldn't run any more. Mal struggled to his knees, raising the blue crystal defensively, though his hands were shaking violently. The creatures surged forward, their jaws snapping hungrily at the silence of the upper floor. Suddenly, the golden light of the atrium dimmed. Stepping out from the shadows behind the moonstone desk, moving with a silent, terrifying grace, was the 9-foot-tall librarian. The heavy grey silk of her robes flared out around her like a storm cloud. Her 2 pitch-black eyes were fixed coldly on the swarm, but the massive yellow cat-eye on her forehead was blazing with absolute furious power. She didn't project a single thought into their minds. She didn't use telepathy. The librarian simply raised her long, chalk-white arm and extended a single slender finger. She pressed it firmly to her pale lips, and for the first time in uncounted centuries, the librarian spoke out loud. Shh! The sound wasn't a whisper, it was a shock wave. A massive, invisible wall of pure concussive force erupted from her lips, tearing through the golden air of the atrium. The force slammed into the swarm of nightmares with the power of a hurricane. The creatures shrieked, a horrific, soundless wail of pure dissonance as they were violently blasted backward. The spindly legs and wet tentacles were swept off the polished wood entirely, hurled back down into the pitch-black abyss of the iron staircase. The librarian slowly lowered her hand. The golden light of the library instantly returned to normal, and the absolute heavy silence fell over the atrium once more. She turned her 3 eyes down to where Alice and Mal lay panting on the floor. "I told you," the ancient telepathic voice echoed coolly in their minds, carrying the distinct tone of a profoundly irritated scholar. Silence in the archives. Before Alice or Mal could even attempt to apologize, the soft padding of paws echoed across the polished wood. Mango and Popit trotted rapidly into the atrium, their golden eyes wide as they took in the scene. The 2 humans were sprawled on the floor, covered in cold sweat and glowing green dust from the lower levels. The heavy scent of ozone and rotting ocean water still hung thickly in the air around the iron staircase. Mango stopped a few feet away, his nose wrinkling in visible disgust. "I specifically recall mentioning my desire for a fish," Mango projected into the quiet room, his tail flicking sharply as he surveyed the mess. "But this is certainly not fresh fish. The bouquet is distinctly decaying horror mixed with terrified human. What happened to you 2? "No time for that," Mal gasped, finally finding his voice. He pushed himself onto his knees, still clutching the silver and gold disc tightly against his chest. He looked past the cats, bowing his head deeply toward the towering librarian. "We found the tome. I saw the coordinates. We are leaving immediately. Thank you, Keeper of the Stars, for everything." Alice scrambled to her feet, her legs still trembling uncontrollably from the climb. She placed her hands together and bowed toward the moonstone desk. Thank you. We owe you our lives." The librarian did not smile, but the fierce, blazing intensity in her yellow cat eye softened just a fraction. "Go, little weavers," she projected into all of their minds, the ancient voice wrapping around them like a protective cloak. "Find the dark magician, restore the balance. Do not let the dissonance spread any further." Without another word, the 9-foot-tall figure turned and melted silently back into the endless shadows of the stacks. Alice let out a shaky breath, turning to the two cats. "Did you find anything? A way out?" "We did," Popit confirmed, his sleek black head nodding sharply. "A dormant veil, highly stable, located just a few aisles from here. Are you certain you have the coordinates?" "I have them," Mal said, sounding determined as he climbed to his feet. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. "Let's not waste any time. Take us there." Mango and Popit turned, leading the two exhausted humans back down the northern corridor. They moved quickly, passing the floating weather vials and the crystal books without a second glance. Finally, the cats stopped in the center of a small, circular reading nook, illuminated by a single floating candle. Alice looked around the empty space, confusion furrowing her brow. "Where is it?" "Look up," Mango projected smoothly, sitting neatly beside a velvet chair. Alice craned her neck. High above them, nestled snugly between a floating wooden staircase and the very top of a towering oak bookcase filled with ancient scrolls, the air was shivering. It was a faint, delicate distortion, but unmistakable. "We have to climb?" Alice asked, her shoulders slumping. After the terrifying sprint up the iron staircase from the lower levels, her legs felt like lead. Mal sighed heavily, already moving toward the base of the massive oak shelves. "It seems we have no choice. The portal is hovering almost 20 feet off the ground." "We shall assist," Popit projected. Without waiting for permission, Popit gracefully leapt onto Mal's shoulder, his sharp claws finding purchase in the thick linen of the Scotsman's tunic. A second later, Mango hopped up onto the edge of the velvet chair and vaulted onto Alice's back, scrambling up to perch securely on her right shoulder, his tail wrapping around her neck for balance. "Ow! Okay, claws away, please," Alice muttered, adjusting her makeshift backpack as she reached for the first sturdy shelf. With the cats clinging to them like furry, telepathic gargoyles, the two humans began the grueling ascent. They scaled the towering oak bookcase, using the thick, jutting shelves like the rungs of a ladder, carefully maneuvering around priceless ancient scrolls and leather-bound tomes. When they finally reached the very top of the shelf, Alice hoisted herself up, sitting heavily on the dusty wood with her legs dangling over the edge. Mal pulled himself up beside her. They were now slightly above the shivering distortion, looking down at the rippling air. "All right," Mal breathed, pulling the leather pouch from his tunic and retrieving the silver and gold device. He held the disc up to his right eye, staring deeply into the flawless blue crystal. His expression tightened with intense concentration. Slowly, the blue light within the crystal flared to life, not just illuminating the dark corners of the library, but locking onto the dormant portal below them. The shivering air began to warp violently. The blue geometric lines on Mango and Popit's coats instantly ignited, pulsing in a brilliant synchronized rhythm with Mal's device. Mal closed his eyes tightly, pushing the terrifying image he had seen in the obsidian tome to the absolute forefront of his mind. He pictured the swirling, dissonant storm of Severin's realm, feeling the raw, chaotic frequency of the dark magician's magic burn behind his eyelids. He channeled that dreadful memory directly into the silver and gold disc, mentally demanding the device connect to those specific, impossible coordinates. "I have him," Mal said, his voice strained as the magic pulled at the metal in his hands. "Portal weavers, tear it open." The cats didn't need to be told twice. Their golden eyes flashed and their glowing azure runes flared blindingly bright. With a sound like tearing silk, the dormant veil ripped wide open. A swirling, violent vortex of dark, stormy energy blossomed directly beneath them, crackling with a distinctly different resonance than any portal Alice had felt before. It didn't feel like the cool ozone of the briarwood or the hot sand of Bast. It felt heavy. It felt like dissonance. Alice looked at Mal. He looked back at her, the blue light of the portal reflecting in his terrified but determined eyes. He nodded once. With a leap of faith, Mal murmured. Together, with the two glowing black cats clinging tightly to their shoulders, they pushed off the edge of the towering bookcase and jumped into the dark, swirling portal.